Hey everybody, how's it going? My name's Faz Kareem, and I'd like to welcome everyone to Excel 2019 Pivot Tables. This is a great hands-on e-learning course designed to show you the Excel pivot table while using Excel 2019, the latest version of the software. Now, throughout this e-learning course, I want to point out that I like to go ahead and make it a little hands-on. So you might hear me say, let's go ahead and pause this video and try out exactly what I just showed you. Or you might see me just give you a few seconds to go ahead and fill in the same fields that I'm filling in throughout this course. Now, if you don't feel like there is enough time to try out these exercises, feel free to give a little pause on the video and come right back once you feel comfortable and you had enough time playing around with the features that we're covering. Now with Excel pivot tables, that data analytic tool that everyone loves, well, there's quite a few topics that we have to cover for us to understand how to use it to its full effect. Now for Excel pivot tables, before we even build our very first pivot table, we're going to look at some raw data and see how we can go ahead and extract more data from it and how to deal with lists of data. And then sometimes when we're working with data, it's not all put together the way we need it to be. And we need to learn how to connect different tables. And we'll learn how to do that by using the VLOOKUP function. And once we understand how to deal with data and shape our data so it's ready for the pivot table, we're going to go ahead and dive into the pivot table and see the basics of it all. Learn how to go ahead and build one from scratch. Learn about what each pivot table field means. And then from there, we're going to talk about this concept of refreshing a pivot table. Don't worry if that doesn't make sense just yet, because it will throughout the course. And from there, we're going to learn about all these different nooks and crannies that a pivot table has to offer and how we can benefit from it by quickly analyzing our data. Now, if this doesn't excite you, I don't know what does, because I'm excited. So that being said, go ahead and stay tuned for these next upcoming videos, and I'm excited to go through Excel pivot tables with you. Alrighty, before we begin and start talking about these topics that we have to cover, let's go ahead and make sure that we have this exercise file that we're looking at right now. Make sure that it's downloaded and it's opened up and we're all on the same exact sheet. Notice how at the bottom of our workbooks have all our sheet names, and I'm currently on the Dealing with Data sheet. Now, in case you did play around with this workbook and you went to a different sheet and you're not on the same sheet that I am, I do want to point out that if you so happen to go to the left-hand corner, the bottom corner of your Excel interface on Excel 2019, and next to those two arrows that are currently grayed out, but if you do a right click, you're going to open up something called the Activate window. This window is simply a vertical list of all the sheet names in your workbook. You can actually use this as a navigation pane. I think that's going to be handy throughout this course and your workbooks at work, in case you need to find a given sheet really quickly. I'm going to go ahead and hover over to my Activate window with a right click and go to the Dealing with Data sheet and hit OK. Alrighty. Hopefully we're all on the same sheet, and if you're not, go ahead and pause the video and come right back once you're on this sheet. So, before we start building these pivot tables to find out some great information about this data, now I want to go ahead and start talking about how we can extract more information from the data that we already have, some data mining techniques. Now when we're building our pivot table, we have these specific columns of data to analyze with. Doesn't mean that we have to stick with this. Now, what if I wanted to go ahead and see a breakdown of the spreadsheet with my full-time employees versus my part-time employees? Or maybe I wanted to go ahead and have a year of hire instead of just the date of hire. Or maybe I wanted to go ahead and have the month of hire. Now, all these values can be extracted from the data that we already have. It's pretty simple to do so. Let's go ahead and build these extra columns that we need so that we can go ahead and build these data fields, and then we can use them once we start pivoting. So the very first thing I want to start talking about is how we actually have the hours worked for all of our employees on this spreadsheet. Now from here, we can actually go ahead and, well, maybe find out which one of our employees are full-time and which ones are part-time. And then we can have a breakdown of our full-time employees versus our part-time employees when it comes down to it. So, now that we're seeing this breakdown over here, let's go ahead and see how we can build this column for our full-time employees or our part-time. So I'm going to go ahead and put FT/PT for my full-time part-time column. I'm also going to go ahead and make this a year column. And I want to find a month of hire column. I'm going to click Shift and hit Tab to go back to the year. I'm going to put year of hire as well. Alrighty. Now you're going to notice that, well, these headers that I have, I went ahead and formatted them as headers. So to make my life easier and to make sure my data set looks nice and clean and consistent, I'm going to go ahead and go to my Home tab. I'm going to use my lovely Format Painter in my Clipboard command group to go ahead and copy over the format of my given headers. Now from there, I'm just going to go ahead and double click the Format Painter to turn it on and have it locked in. I'm going to copy the format over to this cell, and this cell. Now if you haven't been following along, go ahead and pause the video and build these 3 columns of data for yourself so that we can go ahead and extract the data and mine some data from this data set that we already have. So now that we went ahead and built these 3 columns so that we can go ahead and fill in these fields from the existing data, let's go ahead and do it. Now let's all together, let's go inside the cell L5 and give a click in there. And let's use the if function to figure out whether or not we have a full-time or part-time employee based off the hours they've worked. Now with an if function, we have a logical test and a value if true and a value if false. So if they're full-time, let's put FT in the column. If they're part-time, we'll put PT. Let's go ahead and get to it. I'm going to go ahead and use the if function with an equal sign inside of this formula. And now that I have the equal sign in, I'm going to go ahead and type in if and hit Tab to autocomplete the rest of the function in case you don't want to type in all of it. And for our logical test, let's go ahead and select the cell that has the hours worked and compare it with a greater than or equal to 40. Now since we have our logical test, I'm going to put the comma in to move the boldness over to the value if true. And for my value if true, I'm going to use a string. Strings all go in quotes to put full-time as a full-time employee. Now that I have a full-time employee field for the value if true, I'm going to go ahead and put a comma to move over to the value if false. So if the person isn't working 40 hours, then they're obviously part-time. So now that we have the if function in with all 3 fields, or parameters they call them more formally, I'm going to hold the control key and hit enter to stay on the same cell while seeing the formula's answer. Now if you haven't been following along, go ahead and try filling out the if function to find out whether or not you have a full-time or part-time employee in the dealing with data sheet. Alrighty, welcome back. So now that we found this very first formula, or function they call it, I'm going to go ahead and go to my autofill handle, that tiny little square over there, and do 2 clicks, 1, 2, so that I can go ahead and fill in the rest of the values for me, hence the name autofill. So now that I have my full-time, part-time values filled in, let's go ahead and start talking about how we can find the year of hire. Well, lucky for us, within our data, we have the date of hire for all of our employees. So we can actually use this to, well, extract the year from this date. Let's go ahead and use Excel's nifty year function. Type in equal. I just type in YE, and I'm a lazy person, so I'm just going to hit Tab to autocomplete the rest of the function. And here we see that it's asking for a serial number. Interesting. Well, I'm just going to tell it to you. A serial number just means an Excel cell that's formatted as a date. So the date of hire is a date. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And now that I have a serial number in there, I'm going to close my parenthesis, and you should too. And go ahead and hit enter. Now notice how when you hit enter alone, it took you down to the below cell. And then you're going to have to click back onto the cell over here. And let's go ahead and get that nifty autofill handle again. And just to be sure you're on it, make sure you see the skinny black crosshair and then do 2 clicks. Go ahead and try that if you haven't been following along with me. Before we dive in and find the final thing, the month of hire. So, now that we have our full-time, part-time values, and we have every year that the employee has been hired, let's find the month. Now, for the month, there actually is a function called equal month, but it returns a number from 1 to 12. So if you type in month and you hit tab to autocomplete the rest, it's yet again asking for a serial number. I'm going to go ahead and select the date of hire serial number, a cell formatted as a date. And I'm going to close my parentheses and hit enter to show you that it's just a number. I would rather have maybe DEC as December. So with that being said, let's go ahead and use a different function for the month. If you follow along with this, let's just go ahead and hit the delete key on our keyboard and instead use a function called text. Equal TE converts a value to a text in a specific number format. I'm going to go ahead and tab into autocomplete it, and I want to go ahead and get this date of hire, this text over here, and I want it to format it to show just the month. So I'm going to do 3 M's to show the abbreviated month here. And I'm going to hit Control Enter to stay on the same cell and yet see the formula's result. I'm going to use my autofill handle by seeing the skinny black crosshair and doing a double click. And we've now extracted the months from the date of hire. Now to recap on what we've just done is we've able to maybe do a breakdown of our employee list to see who's our full-time versus our part-time. Now we can also go ahead and see a breakdown of how many employees we hired each year. And we can also see a breakdown of our months if we choose to do so. If you haven't been following along, go ahead and try filling out each one of these formulas on your own to see if that we can go ahead and get these formulas down and fill in the autofill handle, and we can mine some data from pre-existing data. Go ahead and pause the video and come right back. Give this a try on your own without having an instructor follow you along. Alrighty. I'm currently in the Excel 2019 Pivot Tables student file. I'm in my instructor file. And I'm currently on the adding related data VLOOKUP sheet. Now in case you're not on this sheet, go ahead and make sure that you take a tour of the Activate window, a simple right click in that general area. We'll give you a vertical list of all the sheet names to where you can access adding related data to VLOOKUP and click OK, and we're ready to go. If you're not on this sheet, go ahead and download the exercise file and make sure you're on the adding related data to VLOOKUP sheet, and we're ready to go. So, now that we learned a little bit about data mining and how to deal with data and how to extract more data from pre-existing data sets, let's start talking about another issue or problem you might face when it comes time to actually building your pivot tables. Now over here on the adding related data VLOOKUP sheet, we're going to notice that we have 3 different lists of data. I have a product list over here, and I have a sales rep with the region they're in. And then of course I have, the entire lot where I have the date of the transaction, the sales rep, the product they sold, the discount, and the units. Now, if someone wanted to go ahead and, well, maybe find out the price of each product and analyze a breakdown of the price, or maybe the price with the discount, they're going to have to deal with 3 separate lists of data. How about we go ahead and maybe connect these lists of data and have the price show up for our products in this table. And then maybe once we figure that out, how about we have the regions show up for all our sales reps in this table so we know what region each sales rep sold from. So with that being said, let's go ahead and use the VLOOKUP function to connect these lists of data together. And then we can, well, pivot off this data when they're all connected in one list. So same common theme as our last example. Let's all go ahead and build these columns that we want to see. I want to see the price here, so I have it all together in one table. I'll go ahead and type in price. And I also wanted to see price with discount. And it'd be nice to have the region of the salesperson in there as well. Go ahead and pause the video and create these 3 columns if you didn't follow along with me, and come right back. Alrighty, so let's get to it. Let's start figuring out how we can add the price of each one of these products over to this list of data so we can analyze it using this information. So I'm going to go ahead and use that nifty database function, the VLOOKUP. Looks for the value in the leftmost column, and it returns a corresponding value from a specific column number that you specify. Now it does point out that the table must be sorted in ascending order for this to work. I'm going to go ahead and tab into the VLOOKUP and fill out each appropriate piece of the function here. Now, with the VLOOKUP, there's 4 different parameters that we have. Let's go ahead and focus on that lookup value. And well, I'm looking for this product, the doublers. I'm going to go ahead and hit a comma since I filled in that value, and I wanted to go find it in this table array thing they're talking about. Now, a table array is simply 2 or more columns of data. I'll give it 2 columns of data. Here's 1, and there's 2. I'm going to go ahead and make sure to absolute reference the table array by highlighting it and just going ahead and hitting F4 on my keyboard to go ahead and do the absolute reference keyboard shortcut for my table array to lock it in place. So now that I have my table array absolutely referenced, I'm going to put the comma in to move over to the next parameter. And now it's asking me, what column do you want me to return this information about the doublers about? And I'm looking for the price. And we know that, well, the products are in column 1 and the price is in column 2. So I'm probably looking for column index number 2. I'm going to go ahead and fill that in too. And I want to make sure that I find the exact price, not something close to it. So I'm going to make sure to put the false parameter for the range lookup. I'm going to close my parenthesis. And don't forget to hold Control and hit Enter to stay on the same cell. And just like that, we found the price for the doublers using the VLOOKUP when we added it over to this table. Before we continue, go ahead and make sure that we got all that, and make sure your function's working properly, and pause the video and make sure that we have all the appropriate fields. In case you got an error message that popped up, good chance you missed a comma, or you forgot to fill in one of these appropriate fields. Now that I have the price in, I'm going to go ahead and double click my autofill handle to find out the rest of the prices. Easy as 1, 2, 3. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and find out how we can maybe figure out the price with the discount that we have for each one of these products. I'm going to use another VLOOKUP for that, of course. Let's all go ahead and do it together. I'm going to type in equal VLOOKUP, and hit tab to autocomplete it. And now, of course, we have 3 or 4 different parameters, and of course that last one's optional with the brackets in there. I'm going to go ahead and find this VLOOKUP, and this time I want to find the price of these products, but with the discount. So I'm going to go ahead and click the doublers and find the same table array. Now, of course, I'm going to absolute reference it with the F4 keyboard shortcut and then put my comma. Now, I wanted to return the column index number over here. And I wanted to find exactly what I'm looking for. But here's the thing, once it finds it, I want it to go ahead and, well, multiply it with 1 minus the discount price. Now let's think about that. Now if I subtract 1 from the discount price, 100% there, that will be 0.97. So it's going to multiply the price times 97, giving you the price with the discount, all in one function. That's exactly what I wanted. Yes. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control Enter. Now that I have the price with the discount, I'm going to do a double click on my autofill handle. And I want to get rid of these extra leading decimal places. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my Home tab and go to the number command group and just knock off a few decimal places here in the number command group. So we're almost there. And just to be sure, in case your function or your formula didn't work the way you're expecting it to, go ahead and pause the video and ensure that you have the same fields and values filled in within each one of your formulas and functions before we move on. Alrighty, great. So, seems pretty easy. We found the price over here, and now we found the price with the discount. What about the region? That's in a whole nother table. Each one of these sales reps come from a region, and it'd be nice to have all the information in one list. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and go into the cell N2 so we can figure out the region using the VLOOKUP function. I'm going to type in equal and find the VLOOKUP and hit tab. Now for my lookup value, it's going to be different than the product this time because, well, I want to find the region based off the sales rep that I have. And now that I have the sales rep in, I'm going to go ahead and tell where my VLOOKUP can look to find the corresponding region for each sales rep. I'm going to give it the table array, that 2 columns of data. I'm going to go ahead and highlight going all the way down this information list and just go across. So now that I have the table array highlighted, I can go ahead and just click F4 to lock it in. I can go ahead and hit a comma to move on forward, and it's asking for the column index number. And it's the second column in this list that I have highlighted. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a 2 and make sure that I have an exact match. I'm going to pick that false option for the range lookup. Hit tab to fill it in. I'm going to close my parenthesis and, of course, hold Control and hit enter to stay on the same cell. And now that we found the West region for Christie, let's go ahead and confirm that was the correct value. I'm just going to go ahead and go to this alpha order list. Found Christie Olson. And just like that, we were able to bring over the region into this list. I'm going to go ahead and make sure to use my autofill handle with 2 clicks. 1, 2. To go ahead and find the rest of the regions for all of these salespeople with the given dates. And now that I found that, I'm going to go ahead and, well, highlight this data so I can get these cell border boxes around the rest of the values as well. Keep it nice and clean. Let's do this together. I'm going to go ahead and put my cursor on the cell address box L2. And let's use this shortcut to highlight the cells. I'm going to hold Control plus Shift. I'm just going to simply hit the right arrow to highlight to the right. Control Shift to the right. And I'm going to highlight going down as well. Control-Shift down. And let's all go ahead and hover up to our Home tab. And in Home, you're going to go ahead and notice we have a cell border button with this little arrow where we can assign all borders around each one of these cells. Now at this point in time, you should be able to go ahead and connect existing lists of data into one entire table or list of data to do a great analysis. And now we have a price with discount, and region with the date of all these sales. At this point in time, before we move on, go ahead and pause the video and make sure that you can go ahead and find the price on your own. Once you do that and feel comfortable, see if you can go ahead and maybe find the price with discount. And when you're all settled up with that, the final objective, of course, is to see if you can bring over the region into this list of data from the sales rep and region list of information that we have here. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can replicate that and come right back. So, I'm on the Excel 2019 pivot table student file. I just named mine instructor file. And I'm currently on the pivot table basics sheet. In case you aren't on this workbook, go ahead and pause the video and download the workbook. And if you ever need to find this sheet, you can just go ahead and do a right click in this general area to see all the sheet names and go over to the pivot tables basics sheet and hit OK. So now that we're here, Pear Creamery sales, we have quite a large list of data. We have the month, the year, the type of ice cream, the salesperson, and, well, how much the sales were. Now, if someone were to ask you what's your top selling seller or what's your bottom selling seller, the most common instinct, the natural instinct would be, okay, I got this. Just going to go ahead and highlight the headers, hover up to my data tab and maybe turn on a filter, and then filter by each salesperson one by one. And then we can go ahead and add up their sales. And we can do that for each salesperson. That will work. But at the end of the day, that's going to take a lot of time just for an answer of who's your top seller and who's your bottom seller. So there must be a more efficient way or better way to analyze this data, hence the pivot table. So we're going to go ahead and build a pivot table so that we can analyze this data and maybe switch this column that says salesperson into a row, or maybe switch the sales column into these values that it can sum up based off the rows we gave it. And everything will make perfect sense once we build our very first pivot table. So I'm going to go ahead, and in case you followed along with me and you turned on that filter, let's go ahead and go to our data tab with the same header selected and just turn the filters off so that we can go ahead and have a nice clean slate. So now that we're looking at this list of information here, let's go ahead and build a pivot table off of it. I'm going to go ahead and insert a pivot table into this spreadsheet over here, or maybe create another sheet for the pivot table by hovering over to my Insert tab. Now in the Insert tab, you're going to notice there's a command group called Tables, and the very first option is a pivot table. A quick summary report allows you to switch rows and columns and see appropriate values using the functions box. I'm going to go ahead and click on Pivot Table here. And over here, you're going to notice the Create Pivot Table box popped up. And because of the fact that I had my cell address box within the data, and I ran up into the Insert tab and clicked Pivot Table, it went ahead and found the entire data set for me and has it all selected without me needing to do some extra legwork to re-highlight all that. Now for me, to make my life easier, I'm going to go ahead and build my pivot table on a new worksheet so that I can show up to the left-hand side of the existing worksheet that I'm currently on, and I can start pivoting away. Now, Keep in mind that if you did decide to do an existing worksheet, maybe have your pivot table show up on this side of the worksheet, make sure it's kind of farther away from the data than just 1 or 2 columns so that they don't touch each other, because you will get a message appearing letting you know that you have a circular reference. So at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and select the new worksheet. And lucky for us, we don't need to add this to the Excel data model, since it's just one list of data and we're not comparing it across 3 different lists of data that we want to pivot with. I'm going to go ahead and hit New Worksheet and hit OK. Go ahead and try creating a pivot table off of that worksheet that we were just on, the pivot table basics, and come right back. Alrighty, now that we went ahead and inserted our pivot table, let's go ahead and just talk about the basics of it all and understanding what pieces we have, what pieces go away, what pieces come back, and how to actually bring them back once they go away. So with that being said, a few things that I want to point out is I so happen to have my cell address box within my empty pivot table. This is my empty pivot table. Now it's actually called pivot table 1 because that's the first one I've built. Now you're going to notice that when your cell address box is inside the pivot table, and only when it's inside the pivot table, you'll have these brand new tabs appear called Analyze and Design. Now these 2 tabs over here will disappear if you move your cell address box outside of the pivot table. If you bring it back, they'll go ahead and show up. You're also going to go ahead and notice another thing vanishes from you. If you move your cell address box, you'll lose your field list. Now if you've never built a pivot table before, this is how you build it, using this area. And if you don't have it, you can't really build a pivot table. Now, you might click away from it and click back, and it'll come back, but sometimes it doesn't. Let's all do this together. Let's all click inside of our pivot table, have our cell address box show within it, and let's close out the field list over here. I'm just going to hit that X. You might receive a workbook with the pivot table that already has this field list closed out. And you're just clicking back and forth trying to figure out, how was this pivot built? I just want to see how they built it, or I want to maybe modify it a little bit. Well, we need to actually turn on the field list. Notice how it says turn on the pivot table field list to work with the pivot table. So let's all go ahead and expose ourselves. Let's all go inside of our cell address box and make sure it's within the pivot table. And click over into the Analyze tab. Now in the Analyze tab, you're going to go ahead and notice that on the very right hand side, there's a Show Command Group. In Excel 2019, you can activate the field list by giving a click on the field list option in the Show Command Group. Now keep in mind that sometimes you might forget where that actually is, and you're going to spend a few times looking between the Analyze and Design to find that darn field list button in the Show Command Group. Now in Excel 2019, no need to manually search. If you ever need to find the field list, or any item for that matter, go ahead and make sure that you're aware of this search box, the Tell Me What You Want to Do box, they call it, and you can just type in field list, and you can turn it on from there by selecting Show Field List, and it'll be presented to you. So, now that we have that down, let's go ahead about actually naming our pivot table and organizing our work so that way it's easy to build this pivot table to see our top selling salesperson and our bottom selling salesperson based off the sales they bring in on the spreadsheet. So in my Analyze tab, the tab that's only there if your cell address box is within the pivot table, let's go ahead and give this pivot table a better name. In the Analyze tab, in the very first command group over here, the pivot table command group, you can go ahead and expand it in this version of the software where we can give a name to the pivot table. I'm going to call it the top selling salesperson. The pivot table is actually one of the only fields that can have spaces within the names. Notice how I can put spaces there. So now that I've named my pivot table, another thing that I want to do to make my life easier when I'm building my pivot table is using the field list and how I can organize it. So before we start seeing our top selling salesperson and our bottom selling salesperson using the sales, how about we go ahead and maybe alphabetize this list of data? Because you're noticing that we have a breakdown of the month and the year and the type. The reason why we have it in that specific order is because, well, the data came in that order. Now in the real world, you're going to have about 20 or 30 columns of data when you wanted to pivot on a database spreadsheet or a live spreadsheet that you're working with. That's not just an example. So you might want to be aware about the fact that we have this new toolbox that was introduced in Excel 2016. And one of the options on the very bottom is to alphabetize your field. So that way they come in alphabetical order and not in the source data order. Let's go ahead and ensure that we can do that by going over to the tools and doing sort from A to Z. Went ahead and alphabetized my entire list for me so that it's easy to use. Now that we have that, at this point in time, let's go ahead and pause the video and see if we can go ahead and set ourselves up by naming our pivot table, maybe alphabetizing the list, and try closing the field list and bring it right back for yourself to see how that acts and just to get the muscle memory of all that down. I'll see you soon. Alrighty, now that the pivot table is set up and it has a name, and we alphabetize the fields that we're working with, let's go ahead and get to it and start building this pivot table. I'm going to go ahead and extend my field list to make it nice and large, since we're working with it at this point. And let's go ahead and together, let's grab the salesperson with a left click, hold it, and drag it over into the rows box of your pivot table, just to expose yourself to see what that does. Okay, so it got a unique list and made a row for each one of my salespeople. Nice. I'm now going to go ahead and maybe get this salesperson field, left click and hold, and maybe just throw it into the columns, and you should too. Now you're going to notice that your pivot table switched that field into columns. Now to pivot actually means to turn. And well, a table is just a list of data. So we can quickly build these tables that are changeable depending on how we turn the data. So let's go ahead and make sure that we put our salesperson back into rows. Because what if we had over 10 salespeople? We'd have 10 columns of data, and that's not necessarily a summary report, right? I'm going to go ahead and grab my salesperson from the columns with a left click, and you should too. Put them back into rows. So, 2 boxes down out of the pivot table. Look at that. The rows and columns. It either builds a row or a column, depending on the appropriate field that you threw in. I'm going to go ahead and maybe throw in another field like the sales. This is actually numerical values. The sales each one of these salespeople brought in on the spreadsheet. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get the sales and left click and hold it and throw it into the values box. And what this is going to do is it's going to run a function like the sum. And it's going to sum up all the sales according to the rows that I have it in. So Bishop's sales is 531,000 here. And so on and so forth. Now sometimes you want to find the average sales or the biggest sale. Your pivot table can do that too. Let's all go ahead and, now that we have the sum of sales inside the values box, let's go to it and do a left click. You're going to go ahead and notice that the value field settings is the last option there. Let's go to that and expose ourselves to that. You're going to notice that we can maybe find the average sales instead, or maybe the biggest sale or the smallest sale. But for our example, we just simply wanted to find the sum of all the sales based off the salesperson that we gave it. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK here. So I went ahead and found the minimum of the sales. Now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and change that back over here to the value field. I'm going to go ahead and find the sum and hit OK. So now that we have the sum of sales and we know how we can change the function that the values box is using, let's go ahead and maybe make it easier to analyze our pivot table. Now, a pivot table can be much larger than this. And if you had over 30 salespeople, this is not coming in any specific order. I'm going to go ahead and do a right click. I'm going to go ahead and sort this to have my largest selling value, my largest sale, on top. Just did a right click and a sort. Now that I have the pivot table sorted, it's a good idea to add those dollar signs within each one of these cells for the pivot table. Now I know a lot of us want to go to the Home tab and just add the dollar sign to each one of these cells. But let's make sure to modify the pivot table settings by right-clicking it and choosing to format the numbers of the pivot table itself from this area. I'll go ahead and make it a currency format. I want 2 decimal places. We'll have my negative number show up in red and in parentheses. I'm going to hit OK. Alrighty. Great. So we have a pivot table with my top selling salesperson and my bottom selling salesperson. That was done really quickly. I just needed to know what 2 fields that I need to throw into these 2 boxes. So now that we've done that, go ahead and pause the video and make sure that you can do that without having someone explain the steps to you, and see if you can replicate having maybe the salesperson break down and the sales that they've brought in. And then from there, you can go ahead and maybe do a right click and a sort, and maybe you can format the numbers as well. So go ahead and pause the video and give that a try and come right back. So now that we have a very basic pivot table built to show us our top seller and our bottom seller, let's start talking about filtering the pivot table and seeing a different breakdown. Like, what if I wanted to see what year these sales came in? Well, we have a years field over here. Let's left click and hold it and drag it into the columns together. Left click, hold. Okay, so now I can see a breakdown of just the years with my salespeople. Now there's only one box that we haven't used yet, and that's actually the filters box. Let's go ahead and maybe see how we can filter for our salespeople. I bet a lot of us want to just left click and hold and drag that salesperson into the filters box. Let's do that together and see what happens. Okay, it put it in the salesperson into the filters box, but you're going to notice that it moved it out of the rows, and it's no longer showing up a row of my salespeople. Not necessarily what I wanted to do, but I can filter for my salespeople now. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that and put my salesperson back into rows, and you should too. You're going to notice that if something's already in the rows or the columns, you already have a filter for it. We have these 2 little arrows in the pivot table. In the rows, I can filter for my salespeople. And in the columns, I can go ahead and filter for the years. Now, I want to call this the more outdated way of filtering, because it won't show me all the options that I had presented. Like, what are my other salespeople? Or if I filter for a year, how many years do I have to filter for? So they actually developed a more modern way of filtering. It's much more visual. And we have it here in Excel 2019. So in case you were following along, let's go ahead and clear these filters for ourselves. I'm going to hit clear filter for salesperson and go up to the column labels. And I'm going to go ahead and clear that and select all and hit OK. So now that we have this pivot table, let's see that more modern way of filtering. I'm going to hover over to my Analyze tab here. And in my Analyze tab, I have a filter command group. Let's all go ahead and expose ourselves to that. And just notice how there's an option called Insert Slicer, a visual filter tool in Microsoft Excel. I'm going to go ahead and insert a slicer for the salesperson. Let's all select the salesperson, and better yet, let's have one for the year too. Why not? And hit OK. Now don't worry, you can move these around with a left click and a hold and just drag them across your spreadsheet. But what we essentially just built was these dashboards to filter our dataset. Notice how the row label turned on? I can go ahead and select more than one option by turning on the multi-select and comparing Bishop to Pullen. If I want to go ahead and see just 2013, I can just select 2013. If I ever want to clear the filter, I can just clear the filter here and clear the filter there. And make sure to turn off the multi-select. At this point in time, go ahead and pause the video, and in case you haven't brought a slicer into the pivot table, make sure that you have a slicer for the salesperson and the year before we move forward, and come right back. So, these slicers are pretty nifty. And you're going to notice that you have a slicer selected when you have these little dots around them. But when a slicer is selected, you have this tab called Slicer Tools, the options for it. I just want to point out that with these slicers, you can also rename them. I'm going to go to my options, and I'm going to go ahead and go to salesperson. And I'm going to go into the slicer caption over here, and I'm going to put the salesperson filter to update the name. I can go ahead and select on the year as well and update that to the year filter. Now that I have that, I'm going to hold the control key to have both of my slicers selected at the same time. Because you might want to customize the look and feel of a slicer as well. I'm going to go ahead and maybe adjust the buttons to have more than one row of buttons here, or one column of buttons they call it. I'm going to go ahead and add that to have 2. Let's go ahead and just have 3 there. Or we'll have 2 here. And then for this one over here, we'll have 3. There we go. Now with this slicer, I'm just going to extend it a little bit. Make it a little bit smaller, because we can do that with slicers. I can go get this buttons and make the width of them a little bit smaller. There we go. I'm going to get this year filter as well and just make it a little bit shorter. Make the buttons a little bit smaller. And I'm just going to put these 2 slicers next to each other. Make sure they're the same height. And then I can select the slicers and I can group them together. And now I can just use this as a little dashboard to filter my pivot table. This was invented in, I believe, 2013, but it's used in 2019 still. Just make sure that you're aware that you have slicers to filter your pivot table. Alrighty, so our pivot table is looking pretty good. Got a dashboard there, we're able to filter it, it's all sorted. Now, what if some new data comes in and we have to go in and add some more data to the original source data that we had? Like, what if we have a new salesperson with some new sales? I'm going to go ahead and add in a new field. Let's all go over to the pivot table basics sheet. And for this one, let's go ahead and put in the month. We're going to put in June, and it's going to be 2019. And I sold pivot tables. And I'm going to be Faz. Go ahead and put your name for that one. And I'm going to go ahead and be in the Faz region. And of course, I have a really large sale for my first sale. I sold 100,000. And for my units, I obviously sold about 10,000 units for that. So I just added in some more data into this data that I had, that my pivot table, sheet 4 over here, was built off of. Let's go ahead and go back to sheet 4. Now, in case sheet 4 isn't presentable and you don't see that name, just make sure that you can go ahead and do a right click next to those 2 arrows You can go over to sheet 4 and hit OK. All right. Interesting. So Faz didn't show up. Okay. Now probably someone's screaming in their head, Faz, refresh the pivot table. Refresh the pivot table. Update it so that I can show the new value. Refresh it, Faz. Okay. So I'll go ahead and do that. Now let's talk about the various ways that we can refresh this pivot table and update it with the new values. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do a right click here to show you that in the pivot table, there's an option to refresh it. I can even go ahead and click on the Analyze tab and, well, there's an option to refresh it there as well. But if I had a ton of pivot tables and I just wanted to refresh all of them at once, I'd probably hover over to my Data tab and click on Refresh All there for all my pivot tables. Now, with the refresh though, I'm going to go ahead and do a right click and hit refresh. Now we're all expecting Faz to show up as a new salesperson with his large amount of sales. I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh there, and Faz didn't show up. Interesting. But let's just go check. But okay, he's there. June 2019, pivot tables, Faz. I wonder why. I'm going to go back into the pivot table again. Now in the Analyze tab of the pivot table, let's all go ahead and go to the Analyze tab. We hit the refresh option. It didn't do anything. I'll do it from here too. Now another thing that we might want to do is, well, check the data that it's pulling from on the spreadsheet. I'm going to go ahead and click, instead of refresh, change the source data to find the data that it's pulling from. So my pivot table, when I refresh it, it's updating it based off these values. Let's go ahead and scroll through it and see what's going on here. Okay. Almost there, went too far. Interesting. Okay, so even the refresh was not including that included brand new row 169. So to make my life easier, I'm going to go in there and put my cursor into the data set. And to highlight all of it with one click, I'm just going to hit Control+A, and I'll highlight my entire data set for me. Control-A. Now that it's added in the extra 169th row, I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And just like that, in the year 2019, we had a new salesperson, Faz, that bring in some good amount of sales. You're going to notice that my slicer has now added in a new field to it. I can go ahead and move that around and use the scroll bar to select the option. The 2019 option has been added to my slicer as well. So now that we're able to go ahead and refresh the pivot table, let's go ahead and do something different. I actually realized in my pivot table basics that on 168th row here, that pull-in, he actually didn't sell this. This wasn't 10,000. This was actually only 1,000. Let's go ahead and change that to 1,978 instead. Now, you're going to notice that the pivot table itself didn't necessarily update pull-in's values over here. Still the same. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my pivot table, and you should too, to notice that his value changed once we refreshed it. Now, the original reason why our value did not refresh and did not get included was because of the fact that we were using a list of data, and a list of data doesn't know when it starts and when it ends. And when we added in that brand new row, it wasn't included in the refresh. But when I updated row 168, Excel knew that I wanted to include that in the refresh, so it updated automatically. So now that we know about the concept of refreshing and how we need to update our source data to include the new existing rows that we've added in if we want it to show up on the refresh, let's learn about something called a table, to where on its own, it's going to automatically update the rows to where when you refresh the pivot table, the values will come in automatically. Let's go ahead and stay tuned to learn about the data analytic tool known as a table and how they work really well within pivot tables. Welcome back. We should start feeling like pivot table pros at this point. We know a lot of nooks and crannies about the pivot table, but there's still more to learn. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and go back to sheet 4, the sheet that has my pivot table. And this pivot table looks great. We have our filters, we have a breakdown of the spreadsheet that we're looking at. But what about the visuals? What about that manager that's the visual person that likes to see charts? Now comes in the pivot chart area, where we can insert a visual representation of the pivot table. Now we can go ahead and go into the Insert tab over here and expose ourselves to the Chart command group, where you can insert a pivot chart. But if you want a quick keyboard shortcut to insert a pivot chart into a pivot table, you're just going to hold Alt plus F1 on your keyboard. If you're on a laptop, you may need to hold Fn to trigger on the other function of F1. Let's go ahead and see how that works. So Alt F1, and just like that, I had a breakdown of my pivot table, but in a visual way. I can sit there and I can go ahead and style up my chart a little bit. Let's go ahead and make it a darker looking one. I like this one. I can go ahead and get the grid lines and I can remove them because it looks cleaner without them. And I can go ahead and, now that I have my pivot table, let's go ahead and pick a better color scheme. We're talking about Excel. Let's do green, different shades of green. Alrighty. Now with these field buttons here, I'm going to right click them and just hide them from the field chart. Because if I filter with my slicer, you're going to notice that the chart's also going to filter itself as well. And I can go ahead and clear the filter, and it's cleared as well. So at this point in time, I want to just recap on everything we've done, because I want to call this the complete picture pivot table. We have our data and a nice summary report to where our manager can analyze. If they need to do a different breakdown, they have a nice filter that's customized, and they're called slicers. And if they want to see a visual representation of it, well, lucky for us, they have a chart. Now, for us, to make our life easier, let's get this chart and select it. And in the Analyze tab of this chart, we can go ahead and notice how we can name the chart in the pivot chart area. I'm going to go ahead and, instead of calling this chart 5, I'm going to be calling it Top Selling Salesperson. Cool. Now we have a name for our pivot chart, a name for our chart. They're matching. I'm going to go ahead, and now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and go to the Actions command group, my Analyze tab, and I'm going to move this chart onto its own sheet for analysis. And this chart sheet is going to show up to the left-hand side of the current sheet you're on, like so, nice and large. Now if you were to go ahead and maybe hit Control plus P, that will go ahead and print out for you as well, like so. I'm going to go ahead and go back there. So now that we're learning about a pivot chart and pivot tables, I like to call this a complete picture pivot table. I do want to point out that the keyboard shortcut was Alt F1. And if you don't like that, you would have to just go to the Insert tab and take a tour of all the pivot charts that you have available in the All Charts list of Microsoft Excel. Alrighty, so now that we know about the complete picture of how a pivot table works, let's talk about how we can make our lives easier when updating and refreshing our pivot tables using analysis tables. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the pivot table basics sheet, and you should too. Now this entire time that we've been working with our data, we've been using something called a list. Now a list is just organized with columns with headers in each one, and each column has the data describing the header above it, down below. Now, with this list of data, an idea that you might want to do is convert it to a table so that it automatically updates when you add new rows, and you have a set of tools to use to analyze this data. Let's go ahead and build this list of information into a table by putting our cursor inside of the data and going to the Insert tab. Now you're going to notice that the Tables command group has this option for something called a table. Now, with the table, there's a few guidelines that you might want to follow before building it into a table so that you can benefit from all the features. And before we build it into a table, we're going to make sure that we have headers across each one of the columns of data. But it's really important that the headers are unique compared to each other, meaning I can't have two headers called region, but I could have a region 1 and a region 2 if I put that numerical value next to them. Now, moving on to the second guideline. We must have headers that are unique, yes, compared to each other, but I can't have a header that's the same name as the dataset as well. I can't have a header called North. I can't have a header called Frozen Yogurt. Now the final guideline is to just have a complete dataset, no blank cells. In case you highlight something, it grabs the entire dataset and you're in good shape. So now that we know about uniqueness amongst the headers, uniqueness amongst the header to the data, and a complete data set, we can put our cursor into the data and go to the Insert tab and insert into a table. Notice how I didn't have to have everything highlighted. I just had my cursor in there and it found everything for me. You're going to notice there's these little marching ants, I call them, around the border of your data set. Now you're going to notice that those marching ants, I called them, include the headers, and you're going to notice that this is checkmarked on. Let's go ahead and make sure that we include the headers into this data set so that Excel knows that these are headers and not actual data, and then hit OK. So now that we have an analysis table, let's talk about all the great benefits that we have now that we converted it to this table. So beforehand, I had a list. A list did not have filters. This came automatically with our table. Now, besides that, we have these banded rows, this blue and then white, helping us easily analyze the data. Let's all go into our Design tab by putting our cursor into our table now, hovering over to the Design tab. And I just would like to expose everyone to the table style options, because we have some options for this tool we're learning about. And one of them is the banded rows that we just covered, because they can be turned off with just a click. And depending on how your data is set up, you might want to use banded columns instead. I'm going to go ahead and toggle off the banded columns and turn on banded rows once more. And now that I have this as a table, I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to go to the Design tab, and I'm going to go ahead and call it the source data, all in one word, because table names need to be in one word. The source data. So let's talk about the power of a table and why we should use these with our pivot tables. Notice how the name's in there. So when I added in an extra row into my list of information, I had to sit there and update the source data and drag across it and include that newly added row so that I can reflect on my pivot table. Now if I go in and I use a table and I added a new value, let's call this 2019, using tables, and this is FAS-K, and this is FAS's region, and using tables, we made a lot of money there, and we just sold one of them. Now you're going to notice that the table automatically expanded itself to include that newly added row that we had. Notice how the table has that little marker letting me know that it's expanded itself. I'm going to go back into my pivot table. And this time, when we choose to refresh, there's going to be no need to update the source data because the table self-expanded and included that added row into the refresh. So just like that, I have a new Fast K salesperson in 2019 with a new value in. Go ahead and pause the video, and once your pivot table basics sheet is converted into a table, try adding in a few new values and refreshing your pivot table each time to see the reflected change, and come right back. So, we're learning quite a lot about the pivot table and how it makes sense to go ahead and, well, use a table when building a pivot table since it's self-expanding. Let's keep talking pivots. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to sheet 4, the sheet that holds my pivot table. And now let's start talking about how we want our pivot table to look and the layout of it all. Now, depending on your use cases and how you want to view your pivot table, this all depends on your personal preference. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and just build a little more advanced pivot table than what we already have. Let's go ahead and maybe see the breakdown of what each one of these salespeople are actually selling to bring up these values that they're bringing. So with that being said, I want to see the type of product each one of these salespeople are selling. So let's all together go ahead and grab the type from the field list, with the left click and a hold, and drag it over into the rows. Now it's okay if salesperson's there because you're allowed to have more than one thing in the rows box. Alrighty. So we can see over here, Fast K using tables, and he has a cell right over there. We have Watson selling quite a few items as well. Now, same with Bishop. Now keep in mind, if you don't want to see these values but you want them there, you can go ahead and expand and collapse them with these little arrows that we have. So if you haven't been following along, go ahead and pause the video and make sure that you're able to see the different type of products that each one of these salespeople are selling. And come right back. Alrighty, things are looking pretty nice and fancy with my pivot table. Now when you have a pivot table with more than one field inside of the rows box or maybe the columns box, you might want to figure out what kind of layout is best to describe the data. Now what I'm talking about is, well, the design of the pivot table. Now let's all go ahead and hover over to the Design tab and see what we have for the different layout options for this pivot table result. I'm going to go ahead and click on Design here. Alrighty, there's my lovely layout command group here, where you're going to notice I have an option for the report layout. I'm going to go ahead and give a click right over here to the report layout to show you that we're currently in what they call compact mode for the pivot table. Now with compact form, you're going to notice that I have two different fields, salesperson and type, inside the rows, and I went ahead and put them all in one column in my pivot table. Hence the name, compact form. It's nice and tight. Now, if you go ahead and maybe switch that over to the outline form, it's going to go ahead and disregard the fact that you want it compact. And you're going to notice, well, you have the salesperson in one column, and then you have the type in the other. If you haven't been following along, go ahead and pause the video and make sure you expose yourself to the compact and outline form of the pivot table to see the reflective differences upon the two. Now here comes the interesting kind of settings that you should just be aware about. So with our pivot table and our report layouts, you're going to notice an option over here calling Repeat All Item Labels. And we have another option down below that says Do Not Repeat Item Labels. They're actually talking about the labels for the salesperson. I'm going to go ahead and hit Repeat All Item Labels to show you that it just repeats the salesperson's name for every single row in the pivot table. Because what if they were selling over 30 products? It might be kind of difficult to figure out, is this Bishop sales or this is Watson? That way you can just list the name on each individual row. Now that we have that, I can go ahead and maybe turn that off by choosing Do Not Repeat Item Labels. So, just to recap on everything, so far we should go ahead and be aware that we have two different pivot table outline forms, outline and compact. Now the final form that we can convert our pivot table report layout to is tabular. And tabular looks a lot like a spreadsheet. You're going to notice that it puts cell boxes around each little value, and it makes it more flat and flush on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my report layout compact mode. And now that I have the default and we went through all three different report layouts, go ahead and pause the video and just spend some time learning about each different layout and what it actually does to your rows and columns. And try playing around with repeating all item labels and do not repeat all item labels to see how that reflects on the pivot table, and come right back. Alrighty, hopefully you had a little fun playing around with those pivot table report layouts. I'm going to go ahead and change mine up a little bit too. I'm going to go to report layout. I'm just going to pick the outline form. Now to make my life easier, I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that I repeat the item labels for myself. I'm going to go to report layout, and I'm going to go ahead and repeat all item labels. Now, once you find a default layout for your pivot table, new to Excel 2019, and your Office 365 users of course, you can actually go ahead and set a default layout for a pivot table off a pre-existing one. Let's go ahead and see how that's done. I do want to point out that if you don't have Excel 2019, this functionality is not available in previous versions of Excel. I'm going to go ahead and click on the File tab over here. And I want to scroll down and see the options that I have for the software. Now, of course, we're dealing with some data here, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my data settings, where we have some new data options, like creating a default layout for the pivot table report here. I'm going to go ahead and choose Edit Default Layout. Now, if you have a certain layout that you created and you kind of don't know how you created it or the steps for it, you can use this to save all the settings that you've chosen. I'm just going to put my cursor anywhere into this pivot table, and I'm going to choose to import the layout from here. Import. Now, with this pivot table here, if you choose not to import the layout, we can go ahead and maybe choose a subtotal. We can go ahead and choose the grand totals. And we can choose how we want the pivot table to be displayed, and right now it's showing me in outline form. And about blank rows, we can insert a blank line after each item. I'm going to go ahead and leave that check marked on, so we have a blank row after each item that we add in. And once we chose to edit the default layout, keep in mind if you want to go back to the original default compact form, you can do so by choosing to reset the Excel default layout. From here, now that I'm happy with all my settings, I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And just like that, we've successfully changed the default layout of our pivot table by heading over to the File and going down to the Options. And from there, we went over to the Data tab and we chose to edit the default layout. Go ahead and give that a try once you've found this preferred layout for your pivot table. And don't worry if you found one that you didn't like, you can go ahead and choose to reset it to the Excel default once you're done. Notice how it went back to compact form. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK now that I'm back to default, and hit OK. Now go ahead and pause the video and ensure that you're able to set a default layout for your pivot table. I do want to remind everyone that if you don't have Excel 2019 and you maybe have Excel 2016, that setting simply won't be available from File Options for yourself. Alrighty, since we're talking about layouts and, well, customizing the design of a pivot table, let's keep talking about it and see what else we can design. Now the word design has came out of my mouth a few times, so I'm going to make sure that I click into my pivot table, make sure that I can see the design tab of my pivot table tools, and you should too. Let's go ahead and take a tour of that design tab. Now, of course, with our pivot tables, we can go ahead and pick a different pivot table style, which is a different color scheme and layout. Now, by default, we have a light table style, we have a medium, and we have a dark. Now, within these table styles, you can hover over each one to see what they call a live preview of all the styles. And once you click it, it'll go ahead and accept it. Let's go ahead and pick one green for Excel. I picked the medium light green, pivot stable style, medium 7. Now, with these pivot table styles, typically people like to kind of mimic their company colors. We can go ahead and turn off the column headers, and then it uncolors them, or we can turn it back on. Same thing with the row headers, and add them back on. Now, with the pivot table styles, we can go ahead and turn on some banded rows. Notice how it added in a line over each row. And if we want, we can turn off the banded rows and add in banded columns. Now, with these pivot table options, you might want to consider, well, building your own pivot table style. You can do so by scrolling down to the very last option from the Design tab and choosing New Pivot Table Style. You can go ahead and give your style, your pivot table a name. I'm going to do Excel 2019 Pivot Tables. And you can simply pick a color for the whole table. I'm going to go ahead and make the whole table nice, and let's do that light green and hit OK. Let's do the first column stripe, and let's make that a slightly darker green. There we go, and hit OK. And I'll do the second column stripe and do a format. And we'll hit OK. We'll pick a different color than that. I'll do this darker green over here. So with these table styles that we're setting up, I do want to point out that you can set this as the default pivot table style for this given workbook, or this document they call it. And once you've chosen all these different fields and how you want it to get colored, you're going to notice that this preview window actually shows you how it's all going to look with the reflective changes. And once you're happy, of course, you can go ahead and hit OK. And you've just created your own custom pivot table style that you can now apply and use with ease. At this point in time, I want everyone to go ahead and just pause this video and go over to their Design tab. And if it's not there, make sure you're clicked into the pivot table. And take a tour of the light, medium, and if you scroll on a little bit further, dark pivot table styles. And try building one for yourself over at New Pivot Table Style. Go ahead and pause the video and come right back and see what you can build with your pivot table styles area. Alrighty. So now that we have different pivot table styles, and we're aware that we can go ahead and customize it and build one and even save it, let's start talking about how else we can customize the pivot table in terms of what it's showing us. Now you're noticing I have a grand total down here. I have a grand total over here, tallying up everything for myself. And I so happen to have a, well, grand totals layout option. I can go ahead and turn off, for the rows and columns, my grand totals, removing both of those fields. Or I can go ahead and go to my grand totals, and I can go ahead and turn on just for the rows. I have a breakdown of my rows grand totals over here per row. Now, if you don't want to see a per row breakdown, you can go ahead and maybe go over to the grand totals and see it just for the columns. We have a breakdown for the columns as well now. So now that we have various different grand totals, I'd like to point out that even for the subtotals, for each one of these fields, we can go ahead and choose whether or not we want them displayed as well. I'm going to go ahead and do not show any subtotals and remove those values, subtotaling up all the salespeople's sales. I'm going to go ahead and show them at the bottom of the group, showing a brand new line with FASK total, Watson total, and Bishop total, and Poland total. If you go over back to the subtotals, you can also show them at the top of the group without adding in a new line to your pivot table. this point in time, go ahead and pause the video and go ahead and expose yourself to the various settings for your subtotals and grand totals. If you like something, go ahead and make sure to save it as the default layout of your pivot table by going to File Options and importing that layout. Now, if you haven't watched the previous video, the steps for all that have been described, and go ahead and take a look at that to see how you can set this as the default for all new pivot tables that come into any workbook in Excel 2019. Hopefully you had a little fun customizing your pivot table and picking that default layout, and you were sure to save it. Let's keep talking pivots. So now that we have a pivot table built, now you're going to notice that within our data, we had several different regions for this company. We have a north, the west, the central. We have a FASs region that we put in. Now, what if you wanted to build a pivot table for each one of these individual regions? I bet someone's thinking, well, FAS, just throw region in the filter and filter for them. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's get the region field and drag it into the filters box. Alrighty, so now we have the ability to go ahead and, well, filter by a given region. If I want to see central, if I want to select more than one item, I can do that too. And I can hit OK. Go ahead and throw in the region field into the filters box and make sure that you can filter using the region field. Alrighty, now that we have that down, wouldn't it be nice to create a separate pivot table for each one of these regions without spending too much time and building a pivot table for each one with the filter applied? Lucky for us, we can use this functionality to build several different report pages off of one existing pivot table. Now, these report pages, they can actually be built by clicking into the pivot table and hovering over to the Analyze tab. Let's all together click into the pivot table and go into the Analyze tab. Now, in the very first command group where it says pivot table, you're going to notice that when you give it a click, you so happen to have some options for your pivot table. Now, with the pivot table, to find the report pages, it's kind of tucked away. You're going to notice that this options icon is two different buttons that are clickable. We have the overall options of the pivot table. Go ahead and see how we can deal with blank cells and how to go ahead and filter things, and if we want to include things in a filter, of course. Also naming the pivot table. But right next to the options is this little arrow. And that's where you get to go ahead and see Show Report Filter Pages. I'm going to go ahead and give a click over here to show you that it's showing that region field that I put in. And when you hit OK, it's going to build you a separate sheet showing you a pivot table for each one of those regions. Let's go ahead and hit OK to see that. Alrighty, I went ahead and did that. Now I'm just going to go ahead and just go through all my sheet names. I'm going to open up the Activate window. So right now it's telling me that it built a sheet for just Central. Great. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And now let's clear this filter. I'm going to go ahead and hit All and hit OK. So now that we have a pivot table for just the Central, and we have one with all of the data, let's see how we can build a pivot table for every single region. Let's all together click into the pivot table and go over to the Analyze tab. Now in the Analyze tab, we still happen to have a pivot table option, and we're going to go to that little arrow that says Options and give it a click. Now when we choose Show Report Filter Pages without any filter applied, you're going to notice that instead of just building the central sheet for us, it's going to go ahead and build every single region. There's FASs region. There's FASs region. There's my North region sales. There's my West. And there's that other central that we just built. And there's the entire lot that we built the report pages off of. I do want to point out that
If you wanted to see maybe a different report page, you can go ahead and maybe select all of them. Throw in another field. Let's all go ahead and throw in the months field into the filters box. And let's go ahead and build report pages using the different months in our pivot table. I'm going to go ahead and click into the Analyze tab and go over to my pivot table and choose the options, that little arrow, and go over to the report filter pages. Now this time, instead of selecting the region, I'm going to go ahead and select months and hit OK. You're going to notice that my workbook got really large. And if I do a right click in my activate window, I now have a pivot table for each month on my spreadsheet here with a different breakdown. Keep in mind they're for various years. I can build a field for my years as well if I choose to do so. I'm going to go ahead and get the years field and throw them into the filters. I want everyone to go ahead and maybe pause this video and see if they can build a breakdown of their pivot table using the report pages based off the year. Go ahead and pause the video and come right back once you do that. Alrighty. Hopefully we didn't have any troubles generating a pivot table based off the year. I'm going to go ahead and do mine. I'm going to click in this pivot table and go over to my Analyze tab. Now, in my Analyze tab, I'm just going to go ahead and open up the pivot table options. Go to that little arrow. And this time, instead of picking the months or the region, I'm just going to go ahead and select the year and hit OK. I now have a 2013 breakdown, a 2014 breakdown, and a 2019 breakdown. All because, well, I'm aware of clicking the correct year or the correct report page from the Analyze tab in the pivot table command group over in the options. Pretty nifty feature that can save you a lot of time if you have to build several pivot tables off of one existing pivot table.
Alrighty. I'm currently on the Excel 2019 Pivot Tables Instructor Data Model file. You have one included as well. It would probably be labeled Pivot Tables Student Data Model file that you can go ahead and follow along with. At this point in time, if you don't have this workbook opened up, go ahead and pause the video and grab that workbook and come right back. Alrighty, hopefully you didn't have too much difficulty finding that workbook. So, in Microsoft Excel 2019, there's this beautiful Power Pivot tab. Allows us to go ahead and add things to a data model. Now, sometimes we have tables or lists of information that we're looking at here. And within all of these lists of information, there's vital information, like we have our products here. We have our sales reps over here. And if you look over here, we have the entire lot. We have the date, we have the sales rep, the product, discount, and units. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and use Power Pivot to go ahead and manipulate these columns of data using something called DAX expressions to build something called Power Pivot tables to go ahead and benefit from and analyze your data while leaving the original source data intact and preserved. Now, in order to do that, the very first thing we have to do is add in the lovely Power Pivot tab in Microsoft Excel. So with that being said, the Power Pivot tab is not there by default. But if you decide to go ahead and add it in, it'll go ahead and be there upon restart and relog in. You just got to add it in once. So let's go ahead and do that together. Now let's all go ahead and hover over to our File tab over here and give it a click. Now in the File tab, for all of your Office products, including Microsoft Excel, we have some options that we can go ahead and modify. Let's go ahead and select that option. Options. And Power Pivot is actually an add-in that we can go ahead and include in Microsoft Excel. Let's go ahead and select the add-ins option there. I do want to point out that we're currently on the Excel options window. We're just hovering over to the add-ins area there. I'm going to give that a click. Now you're going to notice that we have some active Excel add-ins that I'm using, some inactive add-ins that are currently unenabled. But if you go ahead and scroll down to where it says Manage, you can actually go ahead and use this drop-down arrow and select the COM add-ins and hit Go. And you're going to notice that in that list, we have a additional Power Pivot add-in for Excel that we can go ahead and include in. And once we hit OK, with that check mark box selected, you'll now have the Power Pivot tab in Microsoft Excel. Do note, if the tab does not show up right away, try restarting your software and logging back in, and should be there upon restart. So go ahead and give that a try to add in the Power Pivot tab, and be right back. Alrighty. Hopefully we didn't have any issues adding in that Power Pivot tab to our Microsoft Excel 2019 interface. Now that it's there though, let's get to doing some work. Now the very first step in order to make this nice, neat, and organized, let's go ahead and convert these lists of data that we have on our spreadsheet into tables so that they can have their own unique names, and then we'll attach each individual table to our Excel data model here. Then we'll go ahead and talk about how we can manage that data model as well. So the very first thing I'm going to do is click into this table. And we all should know the keyboard shortcut to insert a table. That's Control+T. Now go ahead and create a table. And I'll go ahead and grab the surrounding data that your cell address box is located around. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Control-T. Do keep in mind that we should have the My Table Has Headers checkmark box selected, because we are including the headers so that we know what column of data we're referring to. And Excel needs to know that, so that the little filters can show up right next to the column names. I do want to note that if you don't like keyboard shortcuts, you can go ahead and click into the table and go to the Insert tab over here. And you can go ahead and access the table option directly from the ribbon interface. Same exact thing, just a little extra steps. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK with the Create Table box. And now that we have our very first table, and I'm going to go up to the Design tab of this table, and I'm going to make sure to name the table inside the Properties command group. A lot of people mistakenly name the table inside the cell address box. Let's make sure not to do that, so that we can go ahead and see the table's names inside of the data model, making it easy to work with. So with this one, let's go ahead and call this Table Products. We're going to start with the word table so that we have a nice alphabetized list with all of the words with T showing up in one order. We can have a nice organized list. Now, this isn't necessary if you had only one or two tables, but if you had 5 or 6 different tables you're adding to a data model, consider the naming conventions that you're using to go ahead and benefit from that alphabetized list that we'll go ahead and see in just a second. At this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and go into this table over here and use that Control-T keyboard shortcut. Hopefully you're following along with me, creating these tables as we go along. I'm going to hit OK. Now for this table, I'm going to click into it and go to that Design tab. And of course, we're going to call this the Table Salesperson. Notice I'm leaving them all one word, capitalizing each other word. We have one final step to do that. Go into this table and call it Control-T. And we're going to go ahead and make sure that our checkmark box for having table headers is selected, because we in fact do. And we're going to hit OK. Now for our final table, let's go ahead and give it a special name in the Design tab. I'm going to go ahead and call this the Fact Table. Now in this fact table, if you go ahead and notice, has, well, all the facts of this information. We have a list of our sales reps and the list of the products. Then all the facts of when we sold them and the discount price and how many units we sold is in our fact table. These are just some naming conventions that you might want to consider when naming tables for your data model. Now at this point in time, go ahead and pause the video and ensure that you created these tables successfully, and all 3 of them have a name, and come right back. Alrighty, at this point in time, now that we have 3 tables that are nicely named, let's go ahead and go over to our brand new Power Pivot tab that we've added in the previous videos. In case you don't have it there, be sure to check back 2 videos or so. Go ahead and see how you can add in the Power Pivot tab to Excel. Now from here, I'm going to go ahead and go into my very first product table. I'm going to go ahead and add that to the data model and give it a click. Great. Went ahead and loaded that up to the data model there for us. Notice the table products name showed up. I'm going to go ahead and minimize our Power Pivot for Excel window, because you're going to notice that the workbook's right behind us. Let's go ahead and add in this second one by going ahead and clicking into it and adding it into the data model. Great. We have both of our tables kind of looking like sheets in an Excel workbook if you want to translate the two. We have our table products and our table sales. There's 72 records in there, and there's only 12 records in there, letting me know in the Microsoft Power Query or Power Pivot status bar down below. One more table to go. Let's go ahead and add that in. I'm going to go into that fact table and go ahead and add it to the data model and give it a click. Great. Got that nice fact table in. Looking over here in the Power Pivot data model. Now the very first thing I want to point out is we have all of our table names down here. We can quickly navigate between all the tables. It's nice that we name them so we can go ahead and see them with appropriate names instead of just table 1, 2, and 3. Now you're going to notice that the Power Pivot model has a very similar interface to Excel. We have tabs up here, and within each one of the tabs, we of course have those command groups that we know and love. There might be different tools in them this time, but they're all for our data analytic purposes. Now, inside of our data model, our Power Pivot for Excel, the very first thing that I want to point out is, now that we know the interface is very similar, is we have a views command group that we can go ahead and utilize. And we're looking at the data view of all of our information. Now, in order to go ahead and benefit from the DAX expressions that we are about to use to go ahead and manipulate columns of data at a time and maybe connect these two tables, we need to go ahead and establish relationships to the corresponding columns of data that are related in these tables that we just added into our data model. Let's all go ahead and hover over to our diagram view to see how that looks. Alrighty. So I'm going to go ahead and just move over that giant fact table. Left click hold over here into the center. I'm just going to go ahead and just go to the bottom and extend it a bit. So at this point, we have 3 different tables over here inside of our data model. Now, when you use the VLOOKUP function in previous examples to, maybe bring over the product's prices over into this table, or if you wanted to go ahead and bring in the sales reps regions into this table, you'd have to go ahead and connect relationships. Now, at this point in time, let's go ahead and go back to the data view and give that a click, and notice that we can go ahead and see all of these tables, and we have some products and some prices. And over here, we have our sales reps and our regions. And over here, we have the fact table. Now, sometimes you might want to go ahead and, add in the prices over to this table over here. So let's go ahead and connect the corresponding columns that need to have a relationship within these tables so that we can use a DAX expression to do so. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my diagram view. The view made to go ahead and build those relationships, manage relationships. Now, we did mention that I want to go ahead and have my products' prices go ahead and show up into my fact table. So I'm going to go ahead and relate these products over to this product right over here, the left click. Now, you're going to notice that the table products only had 12 records. That way it can find one match to all of the records. This means many, the little star, to many of the records found inside of the products in the fact table here. Now that we have established this relationship here, let's go ahead and go back to the data view and give that a click. And you're going to notice that inside of all of these tables, there's no typing in Power Pivot. You can't necessarily type inside of a cell. Now, what we can do is manipulate columns at a time to go ahead and just add in that column that we want into our fact table. We're going to use something called DAX expressions. Now at this point in time, let's go ahead and make sure that we're all on the fact table, the very last table with all the information, so that we can go ahead and add in that new table with all the prices. Alrighty. Now at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and use a DAX expression. I'm going to select this column, and you should too. Let's go up to our formula bar in the Power Pivot window so we can go ahead and type in this DAX expression, which is very similar to filling in an Excel function. And it starts out with an equal sign, similar to a function. And I'm going to go ahead and type in RE to find this function known as related or expression that can go ahead and connect and relate a value from another table into our fact table. Now over here, I'm going to go ahead and tab into the related function, or expression I should call it, to auto-complete the rest of the name for me. Now from here, we have what they call an IntelliSense menu that pops up all the available options that you might want to use with this related function. Now we've established relationships, and it's noticing that, well, we can relate the product's prices into this table because there's a relationship between the two columns. We have our products table from our table products connected to our fact table products column. I'm going to go ahead and tab into autocomplete the rest of that for me. I'm going to close my parentheses, hit enter to add in that column to my Power Pivot table that I'm about to build. Alrighty, now that I have this calculated column, I'm going to go ahead and double click into it. And I'm going to rename it product price. I'm going to hit enter to lock in that change. So now that we have this there, let's go ahead and pause the video and ensure that you can go ahead and use the related function. And in case this related function showed up a lot of errors, be sure to check out your diagram view to see if the relationships are connected. Let's get a little more playtime using these DAX expressions and connecting relationships between tables. Now if you notice, there's some more relationships that we can connect from another table over to our fact table if you think about it. Now if you're thinking the sales rep over here, you got it right. Let's go ahead and left click and hold and drag over the sales rep over to the fact table. Now if you would have done it the other way around, it would not have mattered. They both connect and automatically pick up the connections the way they're appropriately supposed to be seen. We have one sales rep and one region assigned to the table of all the salespeople. And we can find many sales reps across the fact table of our data set. Now at this point in time, let's go over to our Home tab of our Power Pivot window. Let's go back over to our data view. Let's go ahead and add in another column. I'm going to select this column over here and add in this column using a related function to go ahead and bring in the regions over into my pivot table. I'm going to go ahead and find that regions there. Tabbed into it, table salesperson region, close my parenthesis and hit enter and let Power Pivot do its work. Alrighty, I went ahead and got the regions in there. I'm going to go ahead and go in there and rename it regions and hit enter to save that work there, and we're in good shape. Alrighty. Now that we went ahead and built these appropriate columns, these calculated columns using these DAX expressions, I do want to point out that in your Home tab of Power Pivot, we have a lovely pivot table option that we can go ahead and generate a pivot table, a pivot chart. We can build a chart and table out of this information. But most typically what we're going to do here is, well, build pivot tables to go ahead and manipulate and analyze this data in a larger scale. This will go ahead and generate those lovely summary reports that we can build interchangeable tables using Excel's pivot table functionality that we've known to have for quite a while now. I'm going to go ahead and click on the pivot table there. Now for my pivot table and yours, let's go ahead and build it on a new worksheet so that we don't have to get it in the way of this data, and hit OK. Alrighty. Now you're going to go ahead and notice that with this pivot table, we have all of our field names, but our table salesperson, we can go ahead and open that up. If I want to see a row of my sales reps over here and the regions that they're in, I can do that. But if you notice, our fact table has all of our information nicely put together where I can go ahead and see our sales reps. I can go ahead and get a breakdown of the regions they come from. And out of these regions, I can go ahead and see the products they've sold. So I can go ahead and notice that this pivot table was built using Power Pivot. And just like that, we built a Power Pivot pivot table to go ahead and analyze our data. And we've connected the appropriate fields that we need to use our pivot table. Go ahead and give that a try and see what pivots you can come up with. And come right back. Alrighty, everybody. So now that we saw a little tour of the Power Pivot tab and how you can work with that data model and how you can add specific tables to it, and how once you go ahead and add in the tables, you can go ahead and use them to build and pivot. And if you need to, you can use those lovely DAX expression to connect those tables with the corresponding relationships. Now I do want to point out that if you have a small data set, Power Pivot isn't your answer. You can go ahead and use Excel's pivot table and tables tool to go ahead and do all these appropriate things in the VLOOKUP function to connect the appropriate data sets. Now, if you so happen to have a data set that's way too large in the amount of columns you have or the amount of rows, Power Pivot's your answer. You can go ahead and use Power Pivot, and it'll go ahead and eliminate that rule where Excel can only handle 1 million rows, and it can go ahead and use Excel's pivot table functionality once you've built that Power Pivot table within the data model. Do keep in mind the entire time that we built this, our original data was intact and preserved and untouched the way we'd want to keep it. Hopefully this was a little beneficial tour of the Power Pivot tab and how to add it in, and a little example of what it can do. I'm going to go ahead and pause this video, and let's go ahead and see our little conclusion and our little wrap up and what we've talked about.
Alrighty. How do you all feel? At this point in time, I want to congratulate everyone for participating and attending this e-learning on Excel 2019 pivot tables. You've completed the whole workaround, and from shaping and cleaning up the data, and to even learning how to connect data using the VLOOKUP. And from there, we learned the basics of a pivot table and how to build one. And we dived in a little further and saw the different nooks and crannies and all these available features of the pivot table, like table styles and report pages, and how to filter your pivot tables using slicers. At this point in time, I want to go ahead and just say goodbye to everyone. And I hope this information is useful throughout work and throughout you completing your task in Microsoft Excel. I'm going to go ahead and sign off, and I just want to say congratulations for completing the course, and have a great time.